Well, hi, good morning. Hope you've had a great week so far. My name's Matt, I'm one of the leaders at Maybridge. Who's been watching the Olympics? I love the Olympics. Brilliant. For a few days, every 4 years, I get really into cycling and archery, and I'm checking my phone as soon as I wake up, see how the steeplechase guys got on. I know nothing about steeplechase except it's just running, but somebody's rudely put loads of obstacles in the way. And this happens every 4 years, 5 years this time, thank you COVID. And then as soon as the Olympics is all done, I'm back to normal life and I don't pay any attention to these sports at all. And it's all about counting down until the World Cup. About a year to go, I think. Last week, we started talking about the difference between these two words, doubt and unbelief. And we said unbelief is refusing to believe. It's when you stubbornly refuse. It's not about evidence or arguments. It's an underlying refusal, although probably a more helpful word than belief is trust. Unbelief is not trusting God, trusting yourself instead and saying, I'll be the driver, I'll be the pilot, I'll be the person in control and I won't entertain any other thought. Thank you very much. We said that doubt is different. Doubt is the struggle for belief. Doubt is when you're honestly asking questions and you want answers. It's when you're in a battle to trust God. Let me give you an Olympic example. Imagine you're an athlete, an elite athlete. The Tokyo Games are about to begin. You have a place representing Team GB, but you've got doubts. You're not sure you're going to do well. You're worried you're going to be in last place and it'll be embarrassing. You've trained hard, you've done all the right things, but you doubt it's going to go well. Nonetheless, you still get on the plane and fly to Japan. You're still involved. That's what doubt looks like, and that's what we focused on last week. Now imagine the same situation, but instead of doubt, you have unbelief. You've decided it's not even worth competing. You don't even get on the plane. You won't talk about it, you won't read about it, you won't think about it. You're not having it, you won't budge. Unbelief is far more depressing than doubt. I really don't want to talk about it, to be honest, but Jesus does, and he says quite a lot, so we have to engage with this. So let me read today's passage and we'll walk through it, but see what you make of this just read on its own, okay? See what you think of this passage with no words around it. These are the words of Jesus. To what can I compare this generation? They're like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not mourn. For John came, neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds. Then Jesus began to denounce the towns in which most of his miracles had been performed because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades. For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. But I tell you, it would be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. What a nice few verses, eh? Can someone make sure this gets read at my funeral? A little bit after this passage is where Jesus says, come to me all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Now everyone likes that passage, don't they? It makes Jesus seem really friendly. It's brilliant for fridge magnets. Nobody wants to go and get their milk out in the morning and look up and see a little picture of a duck in a meadow holding the words, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. They're both in the Bible. As we said last week, we have to hear Jesus on his own terms. We have to hear what he says, not what we think he says, or what we want him to say. And so today we're looking at this very challenging text, but as always, this is always the case, the more you're willing to do the work of digging into what Jesus says and why, the more you take hold of it and see that it doesn't only make sense, it's also full of love and grace. It lights up in a way that it doesn't to begin with. And it's worth the hard work. This is stuff that God is saying to the church and to you and I personally today. First bit again. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, but wisdom is proved right by her deeds. Now note this starts with a question. It's a rhetorical question. In other words, a question you ask yourself while speaking to make a point. Nobody was asking Jesus this. This is what he wants to talk about. He's got a crowd around him. This is his agenda. And in all likelihood, the crowd would have been very positive about Jesus. It's why they're there. They like his teaching. Maybe there's a miracle or two. Brilliant. As far as we can tell, nobody was asking him things and being annoying or shouting or speaking against him. And so Jesus deliberately brings this up at a moment when he was popular. But what Jesus says is a critique, a criticism of the culture around him. In that time, in the small towns and villages, there were basically two things that would draw the attention of the whole community: weddings and funerals. Happy occasions and sad occasions. Each one would have had certain traditional songs that were played every single time there was a wedding or a funeral. So if you were there, then these songs are part of your life, you know them. Now the funeral songs were obviously very sad, what you would call a dirge. They were the soundtrack of mourning. The wedding songs were more happy, people would dance. They were the soundtrack of celebration. And so when the first notes were played on a pipe or someone sung them, everyone immediately knew what tone was being set. This is a sad song or this is a happy song. And in the passage before this, we were reminded about John the Baptizer, sometimes called John the Baptist, but he wasn't a Baptist, he was a baptizer. And his job was to come before Jesus and sort of announce Jesus to the world, to get people ready. And everyone criticised, or many people criticised John for being too dour. John didn't drink, he didn't eat the finest food, he lived this very simple lifestyle, so people criticised him. And the same people pointed at Jesus. He uses this title, Son of Man, about himself, and say, well, he eats too nicely and he drinks too well. And the simple point Jesus is trying to make here is that some people are never happy. They don't respond to the dirge or the dance. It's always the wrong tune. Whatever you do, it's too much this or it's too much that. You're too conservative or you're too liberal. You're too left, you're too right. You're too legalistic or too licentious. And in this way, it's very reassuring to see that even Jesus was accused of getting it wrong. He didn't, but people thought that he did. Really interestingly, while a lot of people these days think religion and therefore Christianity is all about rules and restrictions, Jesus never seems to get accused of being too strict. He only gets accused of being too relaxed, of being too happy and being friends with the wrong people. Tax collectors were regarded the way city bankers are now. They're the people who screw us over and have all the money, and they represent what's wrong with the system. The word sinners was used to describe the down and outs, the drunks, the people who were sexually loose. And Jesus is friends with both groups. You can't do that, Jesus. That doesn't fit in our box. That's what people complain about. He's too nice. He's too friendly. He celebrates too much. And Jesus notices that this happens on a big scale. When he says this generation, he's talking about all of Israel, the entire nation of his people. And by extension, all of us, in a sense, say to God, you're not dancing to my tune. I think you should do this or be like this. And when you don't, I'm not impressed. I won't respond to you. I'll close off to you if you don't dance my way. And Jesus responds to this attitude with one little phrase at the end. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds. Wisdom is proved right by her deeds. In Jewish thought, what you believed and what you did were inseparable. And so Jesus is saying, although me and John are different, he's a bit more dirge, I'm more dance, anyone who actually looks at what we do will see that there's nothing to complain about. We're different, we have different jobs, but look at our lives. Look at how John and I live. And that's always the answer to criticism. You can always argue for this course or this action or this policy decision or this idea, but the real personal character stuff, how a person actually is, how they live their life, that is where wisdom shows up or does not. So Jesus is now speaking very strongly, but he doesn't stop there. What's coming next is even stronger. And remember, however you react to this, Jesus does not dance to your tune. It says, then Jesus began to denounce the towns in which most of his miracles had been performed because they did not repent. Very simple sentence, but it's very challenging to our modern culture. Have you ever met somebody, you must have done, or you might even be this person, who says, well, I'm not sure about all this God stuff. Or they go further and say, well, this God thing, it's a load of rubbish. I'm intelligent. I need evidence. I need God to do a miracle in front of me. Then I would believe. That's what it would take. But Jesus says in this one line that that's not true at all. Modern people like to think of themselves, including me, by the way, as rational and logical and only ever influenced by good, solid, evidence-based reasoning for an argument. And that's not true. All the research says that rationality and logic is only one thing that shapes how people think. And it's not the biggest one when they make their decisions about their commitments and their beliefs. We are not as rational as we think we are. When we read about Jesus, what we absolutely do not see in any account, it never happens, loads of gullible first century people easily believing him because they don't know any better. That doesn't happen. Far from it. Most of the people Jesus interacts with take ages to believe in him, and a huge chunk of people, the majority, are opposed to everything about him from beginning to end. And it's not for lack of evidence. It's something else. There were whole towns where Matthew says Jesus did most of his miracles. That's a lot of miracles. Lots of people saw them. Lots of people appreciated them. They may have been very, very impressed. But that's not enough. Jesus denounces these towns because they didn't do what? Repent. Repent's an old-fashioned word. It's seen as a negative, but it's basically a positive. It's about turning away from your own ways and self-dependence and saying, God, I'm sorry, I need Jesus. It's a heart issue, not a head issue. People do not repent purely on the basis of evidence. It helps, it's a starter to get you going, but it's not enough. And so when someone says, if I had enough evidence right before my eyes, I would believe, Jesus' answer is, no, you wouldn't. Because I can show you hundreds, even thousands of people who did see, and yet they still don't believe. It's more than that equation. Look at how Jesus gets specific. He says, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. Very strong. Who is Jesus speaking against here? Chorazin and Bethsaida were just fairly bog-standard little towns. They were pretty ordinary. It's like if Jesus said, woe to you, Haywards Heath, woe to you, Pulborough. The thing about this is, Chorazin and Bethsaida, because they were ordinary, they weren't particularly bad. They hadn't done some terrible thing, they hadn't committed genocide or anything, and yet Jesus is very strong with them. And the reason for that, the issue is not how bad you've been, but how you respond to Jesus himself. These towns saw Jesus do the miraculous stuff nobody else who'd ever lived had seen. They are overloaded with good reasons to believe in him. They didn't try to stop him or anything. They just say, nah, we're kind of impressed, but we're not really interested. We don't want you. Tyre and Sidon were towns in what is now Lebanon. So they weren't Jewish. They would have been considered outsider people, not part of God's people. And they also had bad reputations historically. And yet Jesus says, if they had what you had, they would have repented. If they had the same information as you, their hearts would be softer to what God's doing. They would have repented first. That's the ultimate takedown. Chorazin and Bethsaida, your Jewishness doesn't save you. Seeing the miracles doesn't save you. Your problem is that you don't want me. That's the issue. Classic unbelief. It's not about evidence. It's about the attitude of the heart. Now, it's quite likely when Jesus said all of this, he was standing in Capernaum. And he saves that until the end. You can imagine the crowd thinking, those guys in Chorazin and Bethsaida, phew, I'm glad I'm not one of those guys. But then Jesus is most heavy with Capernaum. He says, and you, Capernaum, will you be lifted to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades. For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. Capernaum is this little town on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, sort of Jesus' base of operations. He spends a lot of time there. And so it's even sadder that the people of Capernaum have rejected him. They know him really well, he knows them. But Jesus says on Judgment Day, it will be better for Sodom. Sodom as a town was destroyed centuries earlier. It also had a terrible reputation. But if it had had the benefit of seeing Jesus' miracles, that would not have happened, he says. Even Sodom would have been compelled to repent sooner than his guys in Capernaum had. This was not because the people of Sodom were nicer than the people of Capernaum. No. As bad as they were, they hadn't rejected Jesus in the way that Capernaum had. This was and always is the killer issue. It's not how bad you are, how bad the thing you've done, all of this stuff. It's only about what you do with Jesus himself. Now, why is it that way? Why is it about Jesus and not about whether you've been good, whether you've been a nice person? I mean, let's face it, this is so counter to the way the world seems to work and what we get told all the time. Why is it about Jesus? All through this passage, Jesus himself is talking about judgment. That's the big idea he's concerned with in this message that nobody asked for and he wants to share. And he uses the word judgment right at the end of there. It's the second time. It will be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. So I want to give you 3 thoughts about judgment, all from this passage. And the idea is not to make the judgment of God sound more soft and cuddly, because it isn't, but to hopefully point us towards why it's necessary, but also how it doesn't take away from the goodness of God, because that's present throughout. First thought, we hate the idea of judgment because we're judgmental. Now, I'm aware that in 2020's Britain, saying anyone is judgmental is almost like saying they're a murderer. But the fact is, I think that what Jesus is getting at the beginning of this passage is that we're all judgmental. Of course, we don't like the idea, it horrifies us, but it's true. We all have opinions on how things should be, we apply them to other people, and often we're blind to it. We think being judgmental is a problem for those people over there. And as soon as we've thought that, we've been judgmental ourselves. It's unavoidable, it's in our nature. But Jesus goes further than that, I think he's saying we're judgmental towards God. God does not dance to our tune. We want a dirge, we want a dance, whatever. He doesn't do what we want. In our hearts, we think he's wrong. We think we know best. And this is a great irony. Alongside our modern pursuit of logic and evidence, we also hate the idea of judgment. But we don't hate it for intellectual reasons. We hate it for emotional reasons. It feels bad. It feels not nice. It feels unfair. We might even feel like we'd do it better, like we'd be more reasonable, more loving than God. We are very good at unbelief. We have doubts too, and Jesus has sympathy for those, but we also have unbelief. We simply trust ourselves and our own opinion more. We just do. Second thought, we deserve judgment because we're judgmental, among other things. This just gets nicer and nicer to hear, doesn't it? Wait till point 3. But first, we deserve judgment. That's the essence of what Jesus says here. I can't dress that up. It's not at heart about the good and bad actions we do. Right at the core, it's what we do with Jesus. And in our judgment, he doesn't do what we want. He's not the way that we want him to be. We're like the people of Chorazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum. We might be impressed by Jesus, we might think he's powerful or clever, but in our hearts we don't want him. And so we invite judgment on ourselves. Our world tells us it's about us and our preferences and our autonomy and our self-fulfillment, and the customer's always right. But Jesus says, woe to us. We deserve judgment. It's chilling and unpleasant, and it reflects badly on us, but it's true. At root, it's less about our behaviour and more about our unbelief. We push him away and say no thank you. But thirdly, we get judgment from the greatest judge we could ask for. Just as you're feeling depressed, God is the judge that we have. Of all the people in the universe that could judge you, you've got the best one you could have hoped for. He knows everything, he's fooled by nothing, but best of all, he is even more committed to you than you are to yourself. And that's a lot of commitment. When Jesus says the tough words of this passage, they're not said in a vacuum. This is not a shouty, intolerant hate preacher. This is God himself lowering himself to our level in the day-to-day mess of humanity when he didn't have to, knowing that he will be brutally executed and miraculously rise again. And the point of the entire thing is that he loves us and wants to save us from the exact judgment he's talking about right now. The person judging us is the very person who warns us and saves us. Phew. Every word of this text shows us that Jesus is personally, deeply, emotionally invested in every person in the world. And so what's happening is something like this. Imagine you had some symptoms and you went to see a doctor, a world-class, top-of-their-field doctor, and that doctor examined you thoroughly and then called you in and said, well, sadly, you're very sick. You actually have a terminal illness, and that's bad news. But I've seen this before. I've got a treatment that will fix you completely, but you will need to trust me. If you're in any doubt, here are hundreds of thousands of stories of other people I've treated too. This is a cure I made with my own blood. Seems strange, but I did, and it cost me. But all you can do, all you need to do, is trust me with this. Now, most people meeting that doctor would not respond with instant belief. They'd have some follow-up questions. I know I would. But imagine you had that conversation with the doctor, and rather than engage any further, you just got up and walked out, never to come back. That's the unbelief we've spoken of today. That's what happened in those little towns in northern Israel. Well, you might be sat here now thinking, phew, I'm glad that's not me. I'm glad I believe in Jesus. Well, that's good. But the warning here is to good, solid religious people, like the townspeople. In your heart, is it still about Jesus? Maybe it was. Is it now? Have you stopped being soft-hearted to him because he won't dance to your tune, because things are not the way that you want them to be? You might also now be worrying about this because you're not a follower of Jesus and you're thinking, God, this judgment stuff sounds terrifying. How will I know if I'm okay? I want to be okay. Well, if you take Jesus' words seriously, you're heading the right way. That in itself is an act of trust in him, and Jesus always responds graciously to acts of trust. While he's really strong on the reality of judgment, the heart of God is about rescuing as many as possible, not condemning as many as possible. Big picture, this passage is a stern warning about judgment, but it's a warning that comes from the judge who is also the one who can step in and save you if you let him. Ask him to help you with your unbelief. Ask him to help you with your doubts. And so with this really challenging, not much loved passage, as always, when we dig in, the love of God and our need for him is just as strong as it is through all of the seemingly nice passages. It's amazing. It just runs all the way through the story of the Bible. If you're concerned about what I've said today at all, you've got questions, you want to talk, you're not sure about what I'm saying, please do get in touch. I'd love to chat it through. But for now, let me pray. Father, thank you for Jesus. Thank you that everything that Jesus did, and will do. Thank you that you are the judge that we want, that we need. We acknowledge, we repent of our unbelief, of when it's not just honest doubt, it's making ourselves number one, it's pushing you out of the picture, it's ignoring what you say, and we're sorry for that. Please, Lord, convict us today, soften our hearts so that we're open to you and being led by you and what you might have to say to us on this day. Let's be changed by you because you love us, not because you're just demanding a higher standard of behaviour that we can't reach. Thank you that you love us because you love us. Amen.